Can ask real questions. I have Jonathan Painter as our guest today. He uh, lists himself as a advocate for a society that respects individual liberties and voluntary associations. Welcome, Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Paula.
The that sounds like a very libertarian position, I guess. Do you consider yourself a libertarian, or?
Most definitely. I think it's quite interesting because one of the inside jokes for libertarians is that you're not really a libertarian if another libertarian hasn't accused you of not being libertarian. But
I've associated with a lot of libertarians. I've never heard that joke.
yes, yeah, that's kind of an inside joke for us.
But I can see that point. Yeah. So I think what a lot of us, and of course, you and I don't know if that's the first time we met, but I think the last time we spoke was actually at the Nonpartisan party here in Minneapolis.
A great time. Yeah, definitely one of my favorite events of the year.
That is probably the best party of the year. People from all different political associations coming together and just having a great time and talking about politics. Even though politics is forbidden from the discussion, isn't that right?
You know, it's interesting, right? Because I think that was part of, at least maybe the way it started. I think more than anything is that there's definitely an expectation that it's, respectful discourse,
Respectful discourse, yeah.
right? Like that's what I've seen
Which,
enforced is, and it's also kind of, I think it's definitely geared towards more being a social event.
right.
So they're looking for that activism to
But it is
take.
too somewhat of a networking event, right? I mean, it's people that are definitely pretty serious about politics.
Absolutely, yeah. But also, I think it's a great place. One of the things I admire about it is it's so easy for people to demonize those they disagree with,
That and
and it's almost like making everything impersonal. And so, what's nice about this particular event is that you have activists from both sides, coming together and actually enjoying company of each other,
right.
and
So I picked up on the fact that you said civil discourse, which is a big theme in campaigns, right? It's like bipartisan agreements and civil discourse, and we can all get along. Buttigieg was at the dinner last night in New Hampshire. He's talking about how we don't need a revolution and we don't need the status quo. We have this uh, centrist position, right? I mean, clearly he's advocating for a centrist position that we can all just get along, right? That we don't need a revolution. You agree with that?
well, to
Is that the same
some
thing as
degree.
civil discourse?
Well, I think having a conversation, right? I mean, we should be able to have a conversation about it at the very least.
Even if we disagree?
Well, because largely what ends up when you speak about policy, a big part of your policy involves forcing another individual to do something that they don't want to do. And by the very nature of that,
Yeah.
it tends to kind of bring out some of the uglier side of our human nature.
All right, let's talk about that just a little bit before we get in. The show's about climate today, right? So we're going to have a civil discourse about something that Jonathan and I probably have some disagreement over. But the idea, I think one thing that's really difficult for people who don't understand libertarians at all is this idea of voluntary association.
Right.
So, and the best example I can think of probably is unions and right to work. So the corporation, the business owner, whoever, they make their own rules, right? Um, do you believe in right to work, first of all?
Right. So,
You know what I'm referring to in right to work, where
yes.
you can get the benefits of being in the union without paying union dues or following their rules.
Right. So with the if you were to look at it through the rose-colored glasses of the libertarian, if you will, we definitely like voluntary associations. So we like the ability of humans to organize within a labor union. I think it's something, if it's a voluntary association, and then also, it's no one really has the right or authority to tell anyone that they couldn't organize in any fashion.
So, so the voluntary part of it, I mean, if you don't like the job, you go find a different job, right?
Correct.
And if you don't like the union
Your employee,
rules,
if you don't like your employee, right,
right,
then you just get a different employee.
right.
Yeah.
So the employer has that option too.
Absolutely.
But
yeah.
does the union have that same option? They're trying to take that away from the union, so the unions, I mean, if you don't like the union and their rules, you can leave that job as well, right? I mean,
Right.
doesn't the union have as much right to set rules, bargaining on behalf of the employees as the employer?
Okay, so this is where, I think it seems relatively, simple to me, but if you're talking about the organization of union employees, then that voluntary cohesive nature would only be as strong as the voluntary cohesive nature of that particular group of individuals. So if the
So
union
they-
was in discord,
But so they voted to have a union, right?
right, so if they
the
voted to have a
majority
union,
has gotten a union together for collective bargaining to represent
and then, so that union should then
So
be able
give
to
them
represent those
power
people.
against the corporation.
So, in other words, so the flip side then, so another policy that frequently happens, so like it could be any particular group, but sometimes you see a politician step in and say, this particular union can't strike,
Okay.
right? Because of, the nature of their job is so sensitive that we can't be without them or whatever it is.
So
The
that's the government interference part that
Right.
libertarians are sold dead set against, right?
I think
I
it is.
think that's a
I
good
think
example.
yeah. I think it largely would be that. I think, for the most part, and it's not. I. You know, within speaking of, there's definitely a spectrum. But I think like a common theme with libertarians is, that we kind of we look for things to be voluntary. The principle of non-aggression.
So I just want to give people maybe a little bit
feeling?
more
Sure.
perspective on what that is.
Yeah.
I know it was very confusing to me, the volunteer, and then of course if you get into areas of criminal justice, it could get really messy. But let's move on with the climate portion of the show,
Okay.
if that's all right with you.
Let's do it.
In the next
So this is our campaign video. I think you've seen this already, but this kind of sets the mood of the campaign. Paula Overby for Senate.
In the next 60 seconds, America will spend $600,000 on war. War is the most destructive force on the planet. War has failed to give us solutions to international conflicts. Climate is the modern-day challenge, and diplomacy is the modern-day solution. We need to abandon our 19th century ideas about war. A nation focused on war will neglect social priorities, climate action, education, healthcare, infrastructure. That's where we are today. We need a major shift in priorities in Washington. It's time to let go of the past and put the human race ahead of the arms race. The pride of American innovation ought to make us the global leader in climate action. The future of the planet awaits us. Let's not keep them waiting.
Okay, so I think it's pretty clear from that video that we're taking a very strong position on climate.
Sure.
And do believe that climate is a significant threat to the future of the human race, of the planet, of economies, Also, a little bit broader perspective around the environment in general, and that's and the economics of war. So, when we spoke last time we spoke, I think you had kind of indicated to me that you didn't really believe that climate change was real. Is that true, or am I misunderstanding that?
Well, there's a few different aspects to that, right? Because what we're really discussing is man-made climate change,
Okay.
right? And so I feel largely skeptical about the impact of man-made climate change. While at the same time, I think there's a lot of I've worked in industrial plants, and I've personally witnessed a lot of ways in which I think there's plenty of room for improvement with the way that humans interact with our environment and being good stewards of our natural resources.
So first of all, there's the question of climate change. I mean, there's reports every day about melting ice, animals in distress, wildfires. Does any of that indicate to you that the climate is changing?
So what I think is interesting is there's definitely there's a couple of things that are quite popular when it comes to climate change and the discussion of climate change. And one of them is that panic sells. That's your media picks up on that. They know that, if they want to
Like
grab
shark
a headline,
attacks, right?
yes, exactly.
When the news is slow.
Yeah. So it works out to the interest of media to, grab attention with panic. And also it works out fairly well for a lot of politicians. The other thing too is
I mean, I do agree with that. I
Yeah.
very much agree with that. That's how kind of media manipulates our perceptions of the world and politics in general. But we also have notable scientists, many of them, that have been warning us about the impact of climate change for more than 50 years.
And this brings me to what I would consider the other aspect. So I was thinking a couple aspects. One is the media,
Okay.
and the other would be just the way that, a lot of your funding for science and science causes comes also from the need for panic. Because why would you fund a team out, drilling cores in the Antarctica or, the Arctic if you felt that there was no concern? And if there's no funding for these scientists, then where do they make their paycheck?
So you're linking that. I can see
I'm
that
not
point to
saying-
a small degree.
Yeah.
But I have a difficult time linking the advantages of research and climate research to a sheer level of panic, right? I mean, we've been doing climate research long before we had this public climate disaster or panic.
Agreed. And if I actually pulled up a list here of different articles going back in time. Yeah, here we go. Going back in time related to, this goes back to 1895. New York Times, February 1895, geologist thinks the world may be frozen up again. There's these stories.
So these panic stories have been
These
around
panic
a long
stories
time, you're saying.
have been here for a while, and I think this is one reason why you find a lot of folks just don't take it serious. So we could actually have a problem. I'm not saying that we don't, but like if we did, one of the reasons why people wouldn't be taking it seriously is very similar to the reason why the boy cried wolf.
Okay. But beyond the stories, beyond the media, obviously the fires in Australia make huge headlines. The fires in California, anytime we get a big hurricane, I agree, the media plays all that up. But what about the actual factual stories? I mean,
Certainly,
We've
there is
had
some
a-
evidence out there that actually supports concern about human climate change, right?
yeah.
Okay, so here's,
So where do people get the facts, right? If they don't want to rely on the media.
well, if you don't want to rely on the media, and you don't want to rely on government-funded research, there really is very little information to be had.
Okay.
So this is part of the trick. And where do we find some consensus? I actually think that there are places that we could find consensus. If you look at it like a Venn diagram, I mean, and this is just one issue of many, but I think that you could find ways, if everything that you're doing in this conversation is looking to find ways to divide you from someone else and to pull people to your side, then it's going to be really difficult to find these common places,
Okay.
right? To find commonality on issues. And this
Well,
is kind
this-
of what's currently dictating, I think, our political discussion.
And that's the purpose of the show, is to have those discussions, right?
And so here we
And
go.
see if we can. So, I definitely like your point about media hysteria. That's a very well-known phenomenon as well. But I have a little bit of a problem with the idea that government funding and the need to drive that funding makes the evidence not credible. I mean, that's kind of what I'm hearing.
Well,
And
yeah.
even though we do get false reports, right? And I've certainly seen that, but over time, they seem to be, those false reports seem to get weeded out. No?
Personally think that anywhere that you have a conflict of interest, then I think it's worth being a little bit more skeptical. And that's kind of the place I view it from. So when I look into research, I can find some, I mean, there's all kinds of different theories out there. I mean, some amazing things, right? I mean, conversations about carbon dioxide sinks, the carbon cycle. There's some scientists that think that the carbon cycle is actually much faster than others have thought in the past.
That seems to be a growing consensus that it's accelerating. But, I mean, so so you don't feel like there's any independent sources of information? That it's all biased by government funding and the need to fund programs?
Well, there certainly are quite a number. I think it's actually quite overwhelming if you sit through and look through all the different organizations, and it can take quite a bit of time to try and figure out like how each particular organization is funded. And I'm not sure how many people even have time for that.
And is there any way that we can separate some of the evidence perhaps from the bias that might create that evidence? For example, satellite images of the Arctic ice. Does that tell us whether the polar caps are shrinking or not shrinking? Is that reliable evidence? I mean, you wouldn't go so far as to say that the evidence is being contrived just for funding, would you, or would you?
Well, I definitely wouldn't rule it out. I'm somewhat a little bit more agnostic on that point because I feel like there's a lot of other things that we have to work out, because even if we did come to some consensus as to what was actually happening, I think that the bigger disagreement is that we're going to have is, how do we fix it? I mean, if you look at how, the folks on different sides, come to dealing with problems that we have,
Okay.
that we kind of know exist, that we have such a trouble.
And I would agree with that as well. So the other side of the theme from that video, of course, is military spending.
Right.
And also, I take a much broader view around climate, and that it isn't just climate, it's the whole broader issue of environment, right?
Right.
So, and I use my own anecdotal evidence. I see reports that the insect population has decreased by 40%. Like, wow, that's kind of outrageous. A lot of animals depend on insects for food. But I also rely on certain amounts of anecdotal evidence, right? So I remember in my teens and 20s driving through the country at night, your windshield would be plastered with bugs. And that doesn't seem to be true anymore, right? That's anecdotal evidence.
Correct.
I live in a miniature ecosystem out in the southern suburbs in Egan. And we had a lot of different wildlife there. We used to see fox on a regular basis and great horned owls, and there was one species of bird in that ecosystem that didn't exist anywhere else in the state. And progress being what it is, the city came in and they put in city sewer and they doubled the number of houses in that area. And that ecosystem started dying. So that's kind of more anecdotal evidence that just shows me how sensitive the environment is to human progress. So aren't there ways that we can kind of discern for ourselves that the environment is changing? Or that progress is polluting our rivers, or...
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that human beings are the dominant species, or at least appear to be the dominant species on this planet. And you have to consider that if beavers were the dominant species on this planet, then the planet would probably be doing very well with swamps.
I'd go along with that. So we do kind of agree on that, right?
So,
That humans at least have this enormous potential to destroy the environment, right?
we have the greatest potential of any other mammal that I am aware of to impact our environment around us. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you get to get to the issue of what would we do about it, right?
Right.
I mean, what would be the solutions? One of the solutions that I'm putting forward, of course, is to spend a lot less money on war. And, I don't know why that's such a difficult position to sell. We spend, what was the last budget, $753 billion or something like that? But there again, we get into the question of, are the numbers accurate, right? Are the numbers real? Would you challenge that, or?
We spend an obscene amount of our country's GDP on war and military spending. And it's all done in the name of national
defense. The highest
defense.
contributor to our GDP.
It's a pretty substantial portion of who we are as a people. No, I mean, you look at the number of military bases, and this is definitely something that kind of crosses the libertarian spectrum as well as is concerned whether or not all this intervention is actually beneficial.
And yeah, that would be my challenge. And there's the panic factor there as well, right? So we're constant news about the Russians and what an enormous threat they are.
Right.
We went through the Mueller report, the impeachment proceedings. The theme of all of those was national security, right?
Right.
And Trump withheld aid from Ukraine because it was a serious issue of national security. So that's the panic narrative around war, right?
Right.
It's the panic. I'm making a comparison here, right? So is the panic narrative around war, how does that differ from the panic narrative that exists around climate? So people are gung-ho on war, right? That we need that. That's our national security. But we're not at all concerned about climate, really. Even though they're both driven by panic narratives.
Right. And you notice, though, that they tend to cater to opposite sides of the political spectrum.
So the,
So yeah, so that's kind of like that's part of how you
so that's
keep
part of
people
the
divided,
political divide,
right?
yeah.
That would be my observation.
I would agree with that, and I think that's, I want to believe that that's becoming a popular awareness in this country. Um, I mean, it's no secret that that I support Bernie Sanders, that I'm very much opposed to the enormous migration of wealth in this country.
Sure.
I think the military-industrial complex. I think now we have basically the healthcare-industrial complex. We have very large, and this gets into the libertarian ideas of free choice, but those things, and of course, media is become extremely monopolized.
Very.
And those things exist, I think, in large part because of government legislation, right? They couldn't really exist with that, or maybe couldn't have evolved that way without the support of government legislation. Is that? I mean, certainly the military-industrial complex relies directly on government funding, right? Billions.
Yeah, so I kind of feel like, I mean, we could have probably hours of conversation about that, in my opinion. I think high finance and
Definitely.
and military are definitely interdependent because I feel like the greatest contributor to the value of the U.S. dollar is the U.S. military.
We're going to follow up on that. Hi, Nitrous.
But
Where are you? Where is it snowing? The greatest contributor to the value of the dollar, right? Are you talking about now the oil dollar? The fact that we control the oil reserves in the Middle East, or?
so it's said that the U.S. dollar is a national or is the world's leading reserve currency.
Right.
And specifically where the rubber hits the road on that is that there's the expectation that a U.S. installed regime is going to back their central bank with ours.
So a lot of it does come down to
So
economics.
I think a lot of it I think that's the single greatest contributor to foreign policy is money policy. But then if we bring this into climate change, war, I mean, if you I don't know how much, I mean, you've been in the military.
I have not, actually.
Oh, you have? I thought you
No,
were. Oh, where did
that seems to be a major deficit today. All of our politicians are veterans, but no, I've been a peace activist all my life.
Okay.
I supported Eugene McGovern, or Eugene McCarthy.
Okay.
I actually worked on McGovern's campaign.
Okay.
So
So then we're both limited in experience with the military.
Yeah.
But
But
I did grow up exposed to. I was involved in the Civil Air Patrol. I had a great love. I have family in the military. I've always kind of, I've been immersed in a lot of ways in the military, and I kind of understand the thinking and how training progresses and what it looks like, what it looks like for someone who's serving the country around the world, and a great number of friends that are serving now.
yeah, I certainly have that experience.
And so I kind of, it's I put all this together, and actually my own uncle was, naval intelligence and married high in the Navy. My concern though, and my thought is knowing all of this and how the U.S. military, the way in which they interact with our environment. Right, because if we're gonna have the conversation of environmental concern, I mean, we don't have to look any further than Arden Hills.
Right. They do tremendous damage to the environment.
and have for
And
decades.
yeah.
So this is the entity that we're going to give control of our financial resources to fix the mess.
Doesn't sound like a good plan, no.
It seems like it might potentially have some problems.
Being a peace activist, I shouldn't say all my life. I know in 6th or 7th grade, I was writing papers about the domino theory and communism taking over the world. That was the narrative that we were given. It didn't take me long to dismiss that narrative. I'm surprised people still believe in it. But in '68, my cousin was a captain in the Air Force in Vietnam. He was shot down over Laos. He was listed as missing in action for several decades. Back in 2007, they finally brought home just a few bone fragments and some dog tags, and we had a funeral. Very emotional event. But that engaged me a lot in the MIA, POW, the real tragic side of war, right? I had an opportunity to talk to the co-pilot. He was on the ground 3 days in probably one of the largest air rescue sorties of the U.S. Air Force. And you just don't recover from that. And that's a problem that we don't hear about with our veterans coming home with PTSD and untold levels of trauma. We don't know. They're really not allowed to share that information with us. It's a rare conversation that I have with a veteran that really talks about his war experience. And so I think that's part of the issue in terms of how we understand war. We don't see war anymore, right? Or do we?
Well, I think nowadays we're in a greater position to understand war more than ever because of we have independent media out there. If you want to seek truth, I always liken it to like the classic story of which kid broke the lamp.
You
You know,
I don't know that story, I guess.
well, it's kind of a I don't know. So you have a lamp, right? This is how the story goes. You have a lamp or something, some other precious object in the living room that gets destroyed or gets damaged. And as children, you don't want to come out and confess, what happened. You were probably already breaking a rule like throwing a ball in the house but you don't necessarily always get the full truth from one kid. And right, so it's like after interviewing all the kids, the picture of how it all went down, one of them was already upset at the other because, they told on him, and then there was like this other retribution that triggered this anger, that triggered this, and so
Right.
there's a lot more to the story than, Billy tipped over the lamp.
Which is the problem with relying on any one piece of anecdotal evidence, right?
Right. So there you have it. So you have all this media available, and most of us tend to watch the major groups, Fox, MSNBC, or the channels that dominate cable television.
Right.
But there's also, you can access BBC World. You can actually get right onto a Reuters feed yourself. There's all kinds of other independent media out there that actually do exist. I enjoy watching Al Jazeera myself, and you got to realize that when you're following these different news sources, or even Russia Today, when you're following these different news sources, you're going to see a bias, and I don't know how you even get around that, because we're all biased.
Okay, so I understand the lamp analogy. That's generally what I say. If you want to know what the truth is, or some semblance of the truth, you have to look at a broad set of sources and just kind of filter down to what makes the most sense, right? Is that the lamp story?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
So here we are. We have U.S. military, and when we talk about climate change, or even just being good stewards of our natural resources, you know, we have things like, and maybe it's, hopefully it's more of something that's in the past, but even just a testing of weapons. I mean, we're talking about like
Especially nuclear weapons.
you
right?
think about the amount of, so anytime you look at the cost, I mean, if your concern happens to be the output of carbon dioxide, for example, how much carbon dioxide is created just to destroy one weapon in a test,
Yeah.
right? And so,
Or even just to deliver that weapon in a test.
right.
An F-16 will burn enough fuel, will burn as much fuel in 1 hour as the average person uses all year in their car.
Okay, so when you combine that with all of the other vehicles that are moving across and around the world, just into training exercise, I mean, forget the actual real thing. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of resources being committed to war. There's a tremendous amount of, if we're going to discuss like different ways in which you actually can, affect some positive, if we are concerned, right? I think there's a lot of areas in where our Venn diagram could overlap and where we could actually reach some consensus. So what are some common things
I
that,
think we already have reached
Yeah.
some consensus
right,
on where our priority of spending should be, right? Whatever the specific solutions might be, or even if we need specific solutions. It just seems reasonable to spend a little less money on war and a little more money on the environment.
well, I would contend that we would be already reaching consensus if we just could agree and get some support to just bring down our military involvement.
Yeah.
I mean, if we could even just get there, I think, look at what substantial
So
impact
that's a
that
tough
would have.
sell, right? I mean,
It is very tough.
Look, I want to go back to your panic narrative. So, the panic narrative is that our national security is under attack, right? That we're very
Right.
vulnerable to
The
the
Russians are
and
coming.
they're going to invade us. I even heard that from a senator, congressperson during the impeachment, that if we don't stop them in the Ukraine, they're going to be here on our soil.
Right.
It's like, take me back to when I was in junior high, the last time I believed that theory. But anyway, that's the panic narrative, right?
Right.
As for war, we don't see war, right? I'm from the Vietnam generation. We saw our friends getting drafted. We saw our friends coming home in boxes. We saw daily body counts. We saw war on TV every day.
Right.
You don't see that today. I mean, today's media would focus on Soleimani, perhaps. It's like, oh, we killed another bad guy.
Right.
Now the world is safe.
Right.
Oh, I've heard that how many times? We killed Saddam Hussein. Now the world is safe. That was, 20 years ago or 15 years ago.
We got Osama bin Laden.
We got Osama bin Laden. Now we're safe. Those are the narratives we hear today, right? So how do we change that narrative? I mean, that's what this campaign is about, right?
Right.
It's changing that narrative.
Well, it's kind of, I kind of see it like, ultimately we all have to kind of realize the influence that we all are capable of. Because small people are capable, just average people, right? We have the ability to, I think one of the things that needs to change is we need to become a little bit more willing to discuss politics. Like that's one thing that, it's almost become taboo. Like it's like this like Victorian era style code of etiquette,
Yeah, okay.
right? That we don't discuss politics because it might offend someone. And unfortunately, the repercussion of that is, families not having, or friends not having these political discussions. Now we have people who just are ignorant. We haven't had any discussion. We haven't worked out any positions. We lack the ability to even be rational or even consider
Or
the
even,
ups
yeah.
and sides of different
So-
arguments.
That's part of the division, right, is this emotional content of politics, right?
I think so.
To drive fear and anger.
So
and
yeah, so because we
division.
haven't worked out rational ways of dealing with issues, we tend to follow these panic scenarios.
So we don't need bipartisan politics, right? What we really need is nonpartisan politics, right? What we really need is people to come together and discuss their issues, right?
I hate to say that.
You hate to agree with me
I
directly,
do,
I know, 'cause you're a
but really
libertarian,
it sounds no, honestly, I think that largely partisan politics is really in themselves, that is perpetuating, I think, ignorance.
And that's where, I mean, I think that's probably the main benefit that Trump has provided to our political atmosphere is a growing awareness of that, right? That we are divided.
Well, yeah, that's definitely true. People either really love him or hate him.
They love him or hate him.
Yeah, you don't find a lot of people
No.
on the middle with him.
No, and you don't find a lot of people talking about his policies either, right? So, the new Canada-Mexico agreement, whatever they're calling it, I can't remember, but the new NAFTA is what other people are calling it. I mean, that got bipartisan support, right?
Yes, it did. Also, thought was very interesting because these little things kind of interest me, right? So, the left has been, they've obviously for many reasons, have been demonizing Trump, and it's not hard to see how this would come about. I mean, there's so many policy differences, like major departures, like you're on the opposite ends of the spectrum, right? So it's not hard to come around like how you would just dislike the guy to begin with.
Well, I'm not to mention.
Well, I'm
the
not saying
fact that
you
he's
in specific. I'm just saying
lying about
anyone
things.
coming from the, maybe the more left side of.
Okay, yeah.
But like on something like the NDAA or these different parts of like the Patriot Act that have kind of stayed in our
Yeah.
omnibus bills and things. So Democrats actually supported these.
They supported they passed the.
They passed all of, they gave
Yep.
Trump a tremendous, they continued these resolutions that give the executive branch a scary amount of power while they're trying to maintain this diatribe that Trump is a dangerous executive.
A very good point.
So-
Very good point. Yes, I've made that comment myself.
So it's interesting.
And just the war budget too, right? I mean, if you're concerned about his foreign policy, why are you allocating all these funds?
So how do we take these leaders seriously if the very fear that they're trying to perpetuate, they clearly don't believe?
And I think that's the basic appeal of the Bernie Sanders movement, right? Is that we can't trust any of them. No? You're
Well,
not
no,
a Bernie Sanders supporter.
Well, no,
I'm
and
assuming,
I particularly, there's definitely some things that I've come to like Bernie Sanders for. I thought it was interesting that he signed on with, auditing the Federal Reserve back in his days as
Yeah,
working in
I'm big on audits.
in
I've
Congress.
been trying to get a healthcare audit for decades.
So I think there's definitely some things that I've seen some positive things. I've seen some things that are, he's not, I don't think a lot of people would see him necessarily as a partisan guy.
Right, and he is an independent.
Right.
Although
He's running now as on the Democratic. Yeah.
which is the only way you can run, right?
Well,
I mean,
some of our friends would disagree, but
I'm running. Well,
I understand
that's true.
your sentiment.
I have run as an independent. I've run 3 campaigns as an independent, right?
And you've
2
done
for
very
US
well.
House and 1 in the Senate, and done well. But now I'm seeking the DFL endorsement. It's a question of where can you be effective, right? And the rules are so heavily stacked against third parties right now.
Right.
So that's the position I'm taking now, is that there is a significant reform movement. That's what Bernie Sanders represents to me. I saw Bernie Sanders first way back in 2012, 2013, a little union hall up in North Minneapolis, and talking about wealth inequality. And so that was kind of been my line of research for several years, continuing research. There is enormous wealth inequality in this country, and it's getting worse, right? That's my position. And I think that has to be dealt with. Does Bernie have all the right policies? I don't know that any one person has all the right policies, but it is in a sense an independent movement, right? Because it's so outside of the traditional political status quo. And I think a lot of people felt that way about Trump as well, right? I know a lot of people felt that way because I've talked to him a lot when I was out door knocking 2 years ago.
I have, right. And it's funny that you should bring that up because you would think that Trump and Sanders would be so, diametrically opposed. But I have family that, would have, in conversations here before 2016 elections, that was support either Trump or Sanders. Because they viewed both of them as anti-establishment.
Anti-establishment, yeah.
And so for them, that was what they were rooting for, was for anything anti-establishment.
So let's ask Wander Brad, which numbers don't you agree with? But I totally agree with that. And, I think either campaign would appeal to a lot of independent voters for the same reason, unless you're a Green Party. But where was I going with that? Oh, yeah, I mean, I heard that from many people. When I was out door knocking in 2018, running for U.S. Senate, a lot of people really believed that Trump was going to make a difference, that he was going to clean up the swamp. I don't think he's been all that effective. But maybe that's just my personal opinion. But it would be great to see. I would love to see a Trump-Bernie matchup. In large part for that reason.
Well, we very well may get to see that debate.
That they're both kind of outside the system, but I see Trump very much as an oligarch, part of the global oligarchy, if you will, whether that's an organization that exists or not. I think there's when there's big money involved, there's a lot of close relationships there. What connects Trump and Putin? Capital, right? He certainly hasn't been very friendly to the Russians in terms of military policy.
Yeah, it certainly seems to run kind of against some of the diatribe that we were hearing about Trump being pro-Putin.
Yeah,
because I don't really think that's
not really borne out by his military policy.
No, I mean, we're basically fighting a proxy. I mean, the whole war in Syria is a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah, that's been a big part of military U.S. policy since the Reagan era. That was the Reagan doctrine, right? Engage the Russians wherever they are. Star Wars, that was his big program to outspend the Russians, right?
Right. Well, so for me, where I get confused, I've had some good friends. I actually studied the Russian language for a few years. I have some good friends, in the time that are Russian, from Georgia, and have these perspectives, from Russia. Yeah. And deeply ingrained into the Russian culture is kind of an admiration for almost everything American. I mean, there was a time you could literally trade a weapon that was tens of thousands of dollars for a pair of Levi's.
Oh, yeah, I know they like American
Yeah.
jeans. I didn't know.
Different
yeah.
things, it could be a cigarettes, but all things American. And that's kind of I think that's kind of and I wouldn't know necessarily where we are, like maybe in the last 5-10 years, so much as I've kind of fallen away from, I've gotten busy in my life and have fallen away from some of these old friends, but about a decade ago, I was really into, I really had some good Russian influence and some friends, and kind of saw, Americans and American society from their viewpoint. And it seems odd to me that we would have such a huge distrust for people who admire our culture so much. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I
take
just
that
think that we
back
just don't know.
Again, to the polarization in American politics, right? It's the same kind of polarization between two countries. We've been taught to hate the Russians all my life. My father was a Cold War veteran. I heard about the Russians.
Right.
But we don't see the people. We don't talk to the people. I mean, I feel the same way. I know a fair number of people here that are immigrants from Russia. We've maintained visitors from Russia. I go to policy conference. I talk to Russians. Yeah, they don't hate us.
No, they don't.
They sure don't hate us.
No, it's not. And I don't even know like how much there's a lot of Russia fear factor in the United States now, and I don't know how much of that translates to the other side. It's kind of interesting too. Also, there does seem to be somewhat of a kind of a disdain for our Second Amendment in
Russia?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's like maybe an envy.
That's like totally out in left field. I don't know
know
where that
but,
comes from.
Well, I'm just saying, like, I'm just looking for the different, like, I was just kind of looking for a difference. And so that was
Okay,
just one
yeah.
thing and I also thought it would be a topic that we would also find.
Oh, you want to drag
no,
me
I'm
into
no,
the gun debate?
No,
huh?
we're not going to do it. Let's not do it. That'll be like some other future conversation we can have. But I just thought it was interesting that there's different ways in which you would think that there would be more, like common ground that people would find, in different ways, on the right and the left, and so that's why I think it's interesting that nobody's grabbed onto any of those common areas. We've just gone to where we disagree. How about the wall?
Well, I would say
One thing you
nobody.
never, one
Nobody
thing
in
you hardly
politics.
hear about from anyone on the left is the Berlin Wall, and likening that to building a wall on our own soil.
And, yeah.
Because, I mean, I've engaged with a lot of debate with people I would consider more closer to my own political affiliations, but building a wall on a border
Yeah.
is very similar. Even though you might say, well, it controls flow from only one direction, or it only accomplishes this or that.
You can
You can
make
have
all
all
kinds
of
of
these
excuses,
arguments, right? But ultimately, what you're doing is you're building a wall on a border, and it's to separate yourself, from another culture.
Yeah.
And ultimately that was the big thing, with the Berlin Wall. It was dividing people. It was controlling
Yeah,
people.
with separating East Germans from their previous homeland, I guess, right?
Right. And so, that's just one way I think that,
I mean, that was a
You
whole
know-
that crazy agreement anyway. The way they divided up that country after World War II and divided up Berlin, but that's another topic.
but then how about taking down the wall, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that was actually, if we give credit on, from everything from, the partisan that happens to be at the lead at the time, then we would say, what, Reagan did that, or, took down the Berlin Wall.
It did happen during Reagan's administration, I think, yeah.
Well, yeah, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So,
And really dismantling the Soviet Union.
but I'd credit Gorbachev for that more than I do Reagan,
Well,
but anyway, that's
but but they were two
another
leaders.
show. That's another show.
They were two leaders. They were two leaders having discussions,
Having discussions, yeah.
right? And
And
trying,
it was okay
trying
at
to
that
find
time,
ways,
right?
trying to
talk
find.
to the Russians.
Well, was it?
Well, again, we
Because,
can't have
boy,
Trump
did we
talking
ever
to
have
Putin
this
now.
fear.
You certainly can't have Jill Stein talking to Putin.
Well, that's the thing is, yeah. How do we? I personally think that when
Tulsi Gabbard.
when Barack Obama, yeah, she's made some great points. I think about I like her a lot on a lot of policy issues, but particularly the First Amendment.
Yeah, she's amazing, and then you can see where she is in the media.
Right.
So, I mean, I totally support her policies towards war. Even, the First Amendment rights, free speech. I mean, she's up there with all those, I think. But, yeah, it's, you mentioned the wall. I have to comment on that, I guess. The other thing that people don't realize is just how long that this debate has been going on.
Oh.
I mean, the wall, we've been building that wall for, I guess I don't know how long exactly, but for a long time. And it's really kind of a policy, right? It's a policy decision. It isn't just the wall. And I don't think that's part of what people don't realize about that discussion, or they're not even having that discussion, right? What is the policy?
Well,
I mean, we establish, by starting to build that wall, we establish a certain trajectory in our relationship with Mexico, right?
I certainly don't think that we started building that to try to increase, the mixing of the cultures.
Right. And economic equity and social stabilization, and so that's a policy direction we took a long time ago, and we're continuing to pursue it, and Trump pursue it with a passion.
Now, it really doesn't come along a whole lot into our overall topic,
No, not really.
but I mean, other than the fact that I guess you could say it's it's using natural resources,
And
and,
destroying
and,
that,
and committing,
and destroying natural resources, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure there's probably. I mean, you could even say like maybe there's an ecosystem that's affected by.
Yeah, there's
by
a
a
lot
wall.
of concerns about that, right? About animals that won't be able to get to the river, and animals that won't be able to move across or through the wall. So yeah, those are, environmentalists have those concerns. Animal rights activists have those concerns. I don't know, in terms of beyond the wildlife, I guess I haven't really heard of any other environmental impacts of that wall, but cement, yeah. Cement generates a lot of, cement production generates a lot of
Just
CO2.
everything. I mean, even just in construction.
Yeah.
I mean, you have a ton of natural resources and things. So I've heard this last week I heard a kind of a policy idea that I thought would probably gravitate toward, like it would kind of catch traction with kind of both of our different circles. And that was, so the one thing that folks on the right are always looking to do is to look at the fiscal responsibility of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes maybe even hypocritically so.
I
I'm
would
not gonna
very
deny
much agree
that.
with that, yes.
Okay, so
I say that all the time. It's like Republicans ought to be all over this.
Yeah.
Where are they? Where?
yeah, but then on the other token, there are folks on the left who I think sometimes there's like kind of like this angst and desire for some initiatives to combat climate change, and but a lot of these initiatives, I mean, the net benefit, even like putting up a wind tower, for example, a wind generator, now we're looking at the cost of like burying these blades and what the environmental impact is on
Environmental
burying,
impact of bird.
because
birds
you know we
and-
have a hard time getting rid of these things. So I heard, this policy idea of, what if you were actually to, before you actually implement a policy, what if you were to have, to do a thorough study onto the full life and what that cost would be to the environment, to everything that you do in government, whether it's going to war, right, or occupying a country or this particular. What if everything that you did involved you having to make a
Well, that's-
report
yeah.
with how that's going to impact your environment?
That's
And-
the
and-
basic philosophy of GPI, right? Genuine progress indicators versus GDP, right? So GDP essentially is kind of like a measure of work, right? Whereas genuine progress indicators is a measure of actual production and cost. Are you familiar with genuine progress indicators? That,
I don't, I guess I can't,
Okay.
yeah, I don't know if I'm
but right,
particularly familiar with it.
I totally agree with that policy. With that approach, and it rarely happens. It doesn't get done. Environmental impact statements, right? They're supposed to provide that information.
Environmental
right?
impact statements. Yeah, so that is precisely what I think would be something that I think could find traction. And these are the
Yeah.
things, right, as a US Senator that, you could probably easily, find some support for.
And they are finding
And,
traction.
even just in
And our
coming up.
issue here in Minnesota, of course, is polymet and sulfide mining.
Right. Well, so, and there's another great point, okay? So there's a lot of people who are talking about, like, the negative impacts of mining, but at the same time, some of the demands for these, nickel mining and things are actually coming from the desire to have electric vehicles.
I don't support that argument.
Well,
I've written on that. Part of the economic formula for polymet is first of all, the volume of copper that's there and the length of time during which they intend to extract it. And if you look at their numbers, and if you believe their numbers, they're talking about increasing global copper production by 15 times.
that's pretty substantial.
That's pretty substantial. So there is no market for that right now. And as a matter of fact, I don't know, I haven't checked recently, but at that time when I wrote about it in 2018, copper prices were actually quite depressed. There wasn't that kind of demand that they're telling us is there. So, so you're basically talking about, in terms of the economics of the North Shore, you're talking about a short boom and then another bust.
I have personally witnessed some copper mining towns, like up on the North Shore of Wisconsin and in Michigan. There's there's a lot of mining towns, old mining towns that really aren't, they're running very low capacity if they're running at all. A lot of it is just maintaining these mines, because once you build one, it becomes a problem. Then you have to deal with. You have this huge cavity in the earth. You have things. Definitely, I think it's worth having a conversation about, especially with environmental impacts. Personally, like I'm not saying I'm on a particular. I don't even know how helpful it is to even have the debate one way or the other. I'm just saying, I think that this is the all-around place where I think that we should be finding some consensuses. Like, we look at the environmental impacts
Yeah.
of everything of every policy that we're looking, especially for the federal government, to impact. I think we could find some consensus to do that. Whatever it is that you're,
You would like to think
whatever
so.
you're wanting to do. So
Yeah.
here's the bill that
That
we're
would
going to
be-
try and pass.
yeah.
Now, this is what the environmental impact is going to be of this specific bill.
And
if
yet
we
we
could,
seem to be moving in the opposite direction. We're getting rid of more and more regulations all the time. Open up federal lands to more drilling and so production. That's economics. That's growth. That's GDP, right? I feel like that's where we're still at today. But I totally agree with your idea of where we need to go. And I think that it, the I if it's a panic movement, then climate change is a good way to drive that panic. And I guess I'll end with that, right?
All right. Well, it was.
Unless you wanna get your last words in.
No, it was an honor being
Been a-
here on this forum with you, and look forward to working
Well,
with
thank
you
you
more
for
in the
being
future
here.
and whatever.
I think it was a good discussion, and I mean, that is the purpose of this program, is to generate discussion rather than formulate specific policies or have disagreements about issues. So, thanks again. I think with that, we'll call it a day. We are on Tuesdays and Wednesdays as well from 7 to 9. So if you want to tune in or if you want to be on the show, you can just follow the instructions on our page. Have a great day.